Well, welcome to the first actual lecture of your 202 class. Pretty much the first half of this semester, approximately, we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War. Today we're going to be kind of opening up, talking about the causes of the war, kind of giving a big picture overview of U.S. involvement in the war, all the way from kind of 1964 through 1973. Next week we're going to be talking major air campaigns of the war. So those of you who remember a little bit maybe from the 100 class about Operation Rolling Thunder, Linebacker 1, Linebacker 2, we'll dive into those with more depth, as well as kind of talk about some of the special missions the Air Force was doing throughout the war, whether that was kind of close air support, interdiction missions, air-to-air refueling, combat search and rescue, all that kind of good stuff. So we kind of talk a little bit more, what airframes we use for that, kind of what were the effects of those missions. So, but thought we could first kind of go back to your high school history class. What do we remember about, what got us into Vietnam in the first place?
The Cold War began shortly after the end of World War II, and it was basically a war of ideals between the U.S. and Russia, and they were trying to influence the new nations after colonialism ended in them, so like Vietnam, Indochina area, and so both wanted them as allies, and they thought whatever kind of type of government they chose, capitalism or communism, would be like a choice for one side or the other, so they both were in there trying to influence them, and yeah, started a war there.
All right, very good. Okay, it's a very short answer. I like it.
I'm in a class about that.
Okay, very good. Don't judge me too hard.
The French got kicked out of Vietnam in like late 50s.
1954. Do you remember what famous battle? It was in a Billy Joel song.
It's in here, I'm reading it.
Oh. He's trying to be the one-upper on y'all. Citing the reading.
I can find it.
Dien Bien Phu. So that was kind of that last French outpost that fell in 1954. Okay, so anybody kind of know what was going on during World War I? Not World War I, sorry. I don't even know what was going on in World War I in Vietnam. But during World War II in Vietnam, does anybody know kind of who was controlling? It was known as Indochina at the time.
The French.
Okay. Prior to, but who took it over during World War II?
China.
Japan, very good. So kind of that Korea syndrome we talked about last semester. So after the end of the war, kind of that power vacuum emerged. French had controlled Indochina. It was known as French Indochina. So Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, that area leading up to World War II. And after World War II, they kind of sought to regain some control over that area. Obviously, they had some colonial and economic interests in the area. Eventually, they were expelled. U.S. had been kind of helping the French out during that time, kind of with economic support. Obviously, kind of post World War II, like Delaney said, we were kind of that, we were thinking along the lines of the domino theory, the containment policy, to stop the spread of communism. Because if one country falls to communism, what's going to happen next? They're all going to fall like a row of dominoes. Very good. Cool. I think that's a pretty good overview. We're going to watch it's about an 8-minute video. It's kind of going to get a pretty good overview picture. Kind of talk about how our role in Vietnam escalated and how we pretty much eventually got on to that involvement in the war. So, without further ado, I'm not even going to mess with it on the website. Pulled out the CD today. It's not a Legend of Air Power.
Under the terms of the 1954 Geneva Protocol, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to the north, supported by China and Russia. To the south was the Republic of Vietnam, supported by the United States. It was as if the Korean problem of the late 40s had been transplanted to Indochina. President Eisenhower recognized the elected regime of the Republic of Vietnam promised support, he accepted the domino theory that all countries of Southeast Asia would fall one by one to the North Vietnamese if they were not checked. The United States decided to prevent the dominoes from toppling by shoring up the South Vietnamese with military equipment and training. On October 11, 1961, President Kennedy authorized the deployment of an element of the USAF Jungle Gym Combat Training Squad to South Vietnam under the code name Farmgate. The nominal task was to train and equip the Vietnamese Air Force. The Vietnamese Air Force started with 6 squadrons and 97 ill-maintained planes in 1962. Under Farmgate, it grew to an effective force, 14 squadrons and 285 planes in 1965. But it was not enough, and never would be enough. The advisory phase mutated into direct military involvement. America found itself at war. In the spring of 1965, Viet Cong forces increased their activity. A mortar attack on Ben Hoa Air Base destroyed 5 Martin B-57s. There was an attack on the American Embassy in Saigon. The U.S. reaction to Viet Cong activity was a decision to use USAF tactical air power directly. This would include bombing infiltration trails at Laos and targets in North Vietnam. The Air Force recommended that if America was forced into a contest with North Vietnam, there was a quick solution. A decisive bombing attack against 94 major industrial targets would wipe out North Vietnam's war-making capability. At that time, North Vietnam had yet to build a sophisticated defense network of surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft batteries, and MiG interceptors. The only possible way for the United States to have lost in Vietnam was to commit huge land forces. The only way it could have won was with an overwhelming airstrike.
And with your permission, therefore, I'd like to say something.
But by the early 60s, a whiz-kid style of micromanagement had been thrust upon the Pentagon by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. McNamara was a master of quantitative analysis, the king of the number crunchers. He could recall statistics and destroy any briefer whose information was wrong.
And the types of planes that are operating off our carriers today in the South China Sea, because it was then that the...
He believed that military equipment could be procured on the basis of statistical analysis. This belief was not shared by military professionals. McNamara failed to understand that the corporate concept of bottom line cannot be translated into life or death considerations of military requirements. This failure would have a profound effect on America's ability to win the war.
How would they have ever won World War II if they had a direction like that? It was McNamara set the Air Force back 15 years, maybe 30, I don't know.
By 1964, events all over the world could be monitored in real time in Washington, D.C. It became possible for the Commander-in-Chief to issue orders directly to the field on a day-to-day basis. It was a tempting prospect for most leaders. To Lyndon Johnson, it was irresistible. In World War II in Korea, the government had set broad policies for the military to fulfill in the conduct of military operations. But in Vietnam, the government would direct operations on a daily basis. It would prescribe targets and times of attack. It would even select the ordnance to be used. Communications were rapid, but orders passed from the White House would have to pass through the various headquarters the Pentagon, 13th Air Force in Hawaii, 7th Air Force in Saigon. By the time the orders reach the battlefield, the real situation could be completely altered, often because of leaks to the Viet Cong. The results were wasted sorties and vicious ambushes. The Department of Defense and the White House established an intricate and variable set of rules of engagement. These rules subjected military action to short-term political considerations. They also used the incredible policy of graduated response, warfare by measured escalation, designed to correspond nicely to provocations. In the comfort of Washington offices, it was determined that air operations were to deliver a political message instead of devastating damage. The war would be played by signals. It would fall to the men and women of all services to take up the slack of abject failure of civil and military leadership. They would do the best possible job under the worst conditions, and they would find themselves reviled by the public for doing their duty.
But for whatever reason, we were there. And we had American young men there, many of which were conscripted. 55,000 of whom gave their lives. They risked everything they had and they lost it. And I read in Mr. McNamara's book that he said the President and I got many, many recommendations from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of which had a paragraph about the risks involved. And in every one of them, there was the risk of intervention, the risk of attack, the risk of explosion, the risk of that and the other. And so McNamara said the President and I had already agreed that we weren't going to take those risks. You can't persist long in asking your young men, now your young women, to risk everything they have in war if the nation that's putting them in that position isn't willing to share their risk.
I think the video did a pretty good job kind of giving an overview of some of the causes of why how we ended up in the war in Southeast Asia. So general causes of war, obviously a regional power vacuum in Southeast Asia following World War II after the Japanese were defeated. That led to political instability both in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Obviously, North kind of had fallen under communist rule under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. And interestingly, Ho Chi Minh was kind of our ally. We were helping him out during World War II to fight the Japanese. However, after the war, kind of once they sided with China and the communists, that's kind of when we started taking a different look at them and kind of sided with the Chinese against the communist North. At this time, North Vietnam had a desire to forcibly reunite North and South Vietnam under communist rule and install communism in Laos and Cambodia. So they kind of had that desire to spread communism throughout the former French Indochina area. All the meanwhile, America had a commitment to prevent any further spread of communism in the region by force, if necessary. And in the video, you kind of see that, we kind of started out with the training and advisory mission. 1961. Anybody remember the name of the air training mission from the video? Farmgate. Yep. So that's kind of one example of it. A very, very, very famous Vietnam movie actually came out during the Vietnam War, starring John Wayne. Anybody seen it? Know what I'm thinking of? The Green Berets. Very good. So the Green Berets, and that was kind of our initial advisory role. We sent, I believe it was 100 Green Berets right around 1961 also. But kind of between 1961 and 1964, our advisory role kind of just kept doubling the numbers. With ultimately around 1964, I believe we had about 16,000 advisors on the ground in Vietnam. And then come August 1964, August 2nd, it was reported that North Vietnamese gunboats attacked 2 U.S. destroyers in the international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin off the Vietnamese coast. A lot of kind of controversy, were we attacked, were we not, what did the guy looking at the radar actually see on the radar. Kind of all that aside, this was kind of our justification for an escalated role. We were, it was felt that we were attacked, and because of this, you saw in the video, we kind of started bombing some targets in North Vietnam. And President Lyndon B. Johnson, who was fairly new to the office, he retaliated with those strikes, which were kind of approved with Congress passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, significant, really for the entirety of the Vietnam War. This resolution basically enabled the president to wage war without a formal declaration of war. So this was passed 3 days after the attack on Gulf of Tonkin, so it was passed on 5 August 1964, and it empowered President Johnson to take all necessary steps to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and take all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, basically to help South Vietnam or any member of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. So Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, that's what you see up there with CETO. Basically that was the Southeast Asian version of NATO. So in Europe we created the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was kind of its Asian counterpart. Kind of from this point on is when we see United States troops kind of shifting roles from just being advisors into going into full-fledged combatant roles. U.S. became directly involved in combat and took command of all forces fighting against North Vietnam, with kind of the South Vietnamese taking a backseat kind of supporting role in the wars in the years of 1964, 1965. All the way up through 1968. So this previous video clip, it kind of showed some of the issues between the military and civilian leadership in Washington, D.C. We're going to see a lot more of that unfold in the next video. I'm playing here in a minute. So kind of really try to pay attention to basically, some of those issues we ran into, some of the restrictions that were placed on the military, as well as just kind of, how we waged the air war. So I'll be playing this next video here.
On August 5th, 1964, North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, granting the President greater authority to strike back against North Vietnam.
Hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
B-52s were sent to Anderson Air Force Base, Guam. KC-135 tankers were deployed to Okinawa. The B-52s were temporarily kept in reserve as a bombing operation called Rolling Thunder began in the north. The operation was flown primarily by Republic F-105 Thunder Chiefs, supersonic fighter bombers with a great load-carrying capability. Under America's self-imposed rules of engagement, there were some inhibiting refinements to the Rolling Thunder targets in the north. Traffic along roads, bridges, rail lines, and radar sites were eligible targets. But it was forbidden to hit surface-to-air missile sites or the MiGs visible on North Vietnamese airfields. North Vietnamese dikes damming the water for rice paddies were off limits. Consequently, the rice paddies became a favored site for North Vietnamese anti-aircraft batteries. Washington wanted the war to be contained without killing any Russian and Chinese advisors at the airfields and missile sites. MiGs were not to be attacked unless they showed hostile intent by turning in to make an attack of their own. Over the next 2 years, the USAF and the Navy accelerated their efforts under rolling thunder. They flew nearly 170,000 sorties. They dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs. They killed almost 30,000 civilians. American bombing halted in 1968. The halt was supposed to be a signal to the communists that America was willing to negotiate.
By 1968, it was apparent that we were not there to win. We were not allowed to win. Rules of engagement, tremendous restrictions. There were times when we were fired upon, we could not fire back. Airspace, border requirements. And it was extremely discouraging, particularly when we were losing people every day. We were not allowed to do what we were trained to do, what we were capable of doing, what the airplane was capable of doing.
North Vietnam used the halt to bring in Soviet equipment and Soviet advisors. They completely rejuvenated the air defense system. They built 40 surface-to-air missile sites around Hanoi alone. They brought into operation MiG-21 fighters equipped with ATOL missiles, which corresponded to the American Sidewinders. The North Vietnamese were sustaining the Viet Cong and their own regular units with supplies brought down a route known as the Chi Minh Trail. It was an intricate set of roads, rivers, and paths, shielded by a triple canopy of jungle. The trail had been used for centuries by Berets. The straight line distance from Saigon to Hanoi was roughly 600 miles. But the trail was many times longer than that, twisting through Laos and Cambodia, sometimes crossing into South Vietnam. Interspersed with truck convoys were bicycles with sacks of rifles and humans carrying sacks of rice.
We forlornly tried to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was absolutely impossible, up in northern Laos and so forth. And then, of course, we did some in-country work when someone thought they knew where some Viet Cong were, and we usually ended up straight in the trees.
When U.S. attacks temporarily took out bridges or roadways, human labor portaged the material to the next point, indefatigable as a trail of ants scurrying with their burdens.
We couldn't operate effectively at night. So the night was the time of sanctuary for the atmosphere. That's the time that we constituted, repaired, regrouped, got ready for the next day.
Defense Secretary McNamara, believing in the power of technology, authorized $2.5 billion to be invested in a system called Igloo White. Igloo White consisted in part of air-dropped sensors that detected troops or trucks by acoustic or seismic means. Information was relayed to an orbiting aircraft, usually an RC-121 Constellation. It was passed on to Task Force Alpha, where it was analyzed and an appropriate strike force called up. Igloo White had defects and limitations. Chief among them was the intelligent Vietnamese response. When they spotted an acoustic sensor parachuting down, they would locate it. Then they would run a single truck back and forth near it for hours, sending a signal that implied an army was going by. Ultimately, billions would be spent. Millions of dollars of enemy supplies were destroyed. But the net total arriving in the hands of the Viet Cong steadily increased. Just as in Korea, public interest in the war centered around the air-to-air combat with Russian and Chinese-built MiG fighters. But in Vietnam, there was no longer a 10-to-1 victory ratio. The ratio between 1965 and 1967 was about 3.5 to 1. From late 1967 to 1968, it fell to 2 to 1. The truth was that U.S. pre-war combat training had not been vigorous. There had been too much concern about flying safety and not enough about simulating the rigors of battle. As a result of tougher training after 1968, the USAF victory ratio climbed to 3 to 1, but it was still nowhere near the Korean War ratio. A number of factors led to the Air Force's low victory to loss ratio. One of the most important was that the North Vietnamese People's Air Force was strictly controlled from the ground. It refused combat under all but the most favorable circumstances. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom was undoubtedly the best fighter during the 1960s, and in many ways was suited to the Vietnam War. It had long range, could refuel in flight. It was fast, and could carry a heavy load.
In an airplane like the Phantom, it had equipment in the back seat that was not in the front seat. It was designed to be operated by 2 people. It was a definite advantage to have 2 people under those conditions, highly trained, both highly trained, and to be able to fly as a team all the time. Chuck DeVelvue and I flew over 100 sorties together. Chuck was the best of any of the backseaters at UW, and I was very fortunate to be able to select him to fly with me.
What the early Phantom could not do was dogfight effectively with the MiGs. The MiGs were usually able to spot larger F-4s first. Sometimes they would pop up from behind to fire a missile from the 6 o'clock position, then dive away. Dogfighting was also hampered because the first F-4s to reach Vietnam were armed only with missiles, originally intended for use against enemy bombers. Some pilots, like Ace Steve Ritchie, had success with missiles. But often, the F-4's missiles were no help.
The 7th Air Force rule was you had to close on them until you could visually identify them, and then by that time you're inside the range of the Sparrow missile. Most of the time you might even be inside the range of the infrared missile. And so what you're left with now is a gun situation. There's no gun on the F-4.
As a quick fix, rapid-firing gun pods were mounted on the centerline attachment point.
That 20 millimeter gun put around about every 6 inches. And we come in there with two of those guns and just run the whole length of them. Just the boat, you can just see the boat. If we do like that, it would just fall apart, just cut it right in 2.
Between 1968 and 1972, there was virtually no air-to-air combat. Instead of fighting MiGs, the F-4s were turned into bombers, escort fighters. The F-4 was often used in combination with the Republic F-105 Thunderchief. A long series of accidents early in its life made the F-105 notorious. But in Vietnam, it became the supreme fighter bomber. It was the fastest aircraft in the theater. It was able to streak through the tough North Vietnamese defenses, drop its bombs, then, if necessary, dogfight its way out, using its internal gun to kill the MiGs.
But we quickly found that we could, with conventional weapons, using some of the techniques that those of us who had the opportunity to use in Korea, we're still familiar with and could teach and get other people to. Using those techniques with conventional, dirty old 750-pound iron bombs, 6 of them hung underneath the belly, or 2,000 pounds out of it, and we could do extremely precise bombing work with that airplane.
When the bombing of Hanoi was authorized, the mission became known as Going Downtown. The thuds led the way, both in bombing and in casualties. The Thud crews had only a 50% chance of surviving a 100 mission tour. A much larger, older, and more unlikely aircraft became a major player in Vietnam. The Boeing XB-52 made its first flight on April 14, 1952. It was intended as a high-altitude nuclear bomber, capable of single-plane missions to the heart of the Soviet Union. No one in the Air Force or at Boeing would have predicted that 20 years later it would still be in use in Vietnam as an aerial artillery platform, flying in formation, dropping conventional iron bombs. At 30,000 feet, the B-52s were unseen and unheard from the ground. Their threat forced the enemy to break up its ground elements, spreading them out so that they would not be caught in a carpet of bombs. For the B-52 crews, life was a monotonous round of breathing, flying, and sleeping. There was a sense of remoteness to their actions that combined tension, fatigue, and boredom to erode crew morale. Crew members mockingly called themselves coconut knockers for the hours they spent bombing the jungle. But the B-52s were reputedly a weapon most feared by the Viet Cong. By 1968, the United States was aware that it had to disengage from Vietnam. Secret negotiations between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese were intended to provide a framework in which the war would be Vietnamized. South Vietnamese forces would be so trained and strengthened that they would not require U.S. support. America could wash its hands of a war it had never wanted.
Alright, so that video kind of covered, for the most part, the early years of the war, 1964, 1965, all the way through 68. So we're going to kind of start off just talking about the U.S. buildup and the mission during that time. We're going to dig a lot more into Operation Rolling Thunder, which is kind of the major bombing campaign, a little bit more next week. But in March 1965, major U.S. involvement really kicked up in Vietnam with the arrival of several Army and Marine ground units. Kind of at the same time, the Air Force was doing the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign. So kind of around this time, I know you all probably are still on your parents' Netflix still. We Were Soldiers. How many have seen that? You? Okay. Yep, Mel Gibson. So that was kind of one of those first major kind of ground battles. During that time, the U.S. commander in Vietnam, Army General William Westmoreland, he asked for larger influx of American combat troops. Washington was kind of hesitant to provide those troops initially, but after some hesitation, President Johnson approved the troop increase. So you can kind of see, we're talking kind of pre-Gulf of Tonkin, we had about 16,000 troops on the ground. Kind of between then, 1968, 1969, the numbers kind of just kept increasing. After about 2 years, it was about 200,000, 300,000 troops on the ground. And then you can see over 500,000 kind of at the height of the ground war. So just kind of from your prior knowledge or from the video, what kind of hardships did U.S. forces face? Whether it was our pilots in the air or ground troops. Yes.
They underestimated like the ability of the guerrilla warfare for like especially on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, like the thing with the just driving back and forth, like to set them off.
Okay. Underestimated the enemy. During this time, President Johnson was quoted a number of times as saying, "We're not going to lose to a pissant little country like Vietnam." Those are his words, not mine. Okay, what else?
The rules in engagement for U.S. troops in Germany were silly.
Okay.
Didn't make sense.
Okay.
Not the most conducive to winning the war.
All right. What kind of rules of engagement do you remember in the video, or does anybody remember?
Certain strategic targets were off limits because they didn't want to escalate things too much, like SAM, missile batteries, and other military targets, just because they feared the Russian and Chinese advisors might be there.
Very good.
Air-wise, like every week, 2 weeks, attack first. By that time, it was already almost too late. So.
Okay. What else? Said kind of the visual recognition. What else? Kind of an initial problem, particularly with the F4, our primary air-to-air fighter. Okay. Too close for missiles. I'm switching to guns. Well, what's the problem? No gun. All right. That's the only Top Gun reference I'll make all semester. I promise. All right. Any other kind of things stick out to you as kind of things hampering the U.S.?
I think the video said that the preparation for the Air Force wasn't good enough. It was primarily safety oriented rather than simulating the battle situation.
Okay, very good. So, last semester, and those new students in here, we talked a lot during studying the Korean War, where our pilots were extremely successful, kind of in air-to-air combat. So, fighter aircraft against fighter aircraft in the air. We were successful. We had like a 10-to-1 kill ratio. Where here we were kind of talking at times, we were down to a 2.5 to 1 kill ratio. So we kind of lost sight picture throughout the rest of the 1950s after the Korean War, primarily because we were focused on kind of this new awesome weapon we had in our arsenal, which was what? New as 1945, I guess.
Nuclear bombs.
Nuclear weapons. So that was kind of our main strategic posture was, hey, if we're going to be going to war with anybody, who's it likely going to be? Russia. And we just have this huge arsenal of nuclear weapons where, we didn't really have that flexible response to adapt to, maybe fighting this kind of guerrilla warfare. So awesome. We hit a lot of those topics. I'm just going to kind of go over a few more. Obviously, it was hard to identify the enemy, so especially in South Vietnam, fighting the Viet Cong. By day they could have been, just farmers working out in the fields, but by night they could have put on their black pajamas, grabbing their AK-47s and attacking us. So, kind of hard to identify the enemy. This guerrilla warfare, we were not prepared for it. The Army was not prepared for it either. So, you don't have necessarily kind of a front lines scenario where, we move troops to the front and reinforce. The enemy could have been kind of anywhere around us, especially because we were kind of so focused on just, defeating the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. We were not looking too much north of the 17th parallel in North Vietnam. Because what happened in the Korean War when we went north of the 38th parallel?
China.
Okay, so yeah, we kind of had that in the back of our minds. So, in the Korean War, when we pushed, we were doing so well on the ground fighting the war, we just kept pushing further and further north. After we reached a certain point, the Chinese actually sent 500,000 troops over the border. And that's the last thing we wanted in Vietnam. Washington, D.C. leadership, President, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, they wanted to keep this as a small war. They knew it wouldn't be popular, if we kept expanding the war. So those were some of those restrictions. A video talked about McNamara, kind of being a big numbers guy. Anybody know what Robert McNamara did before he was Secretary of Defense? CEO of a major company up in Detroit. Ford Motor Company. So he was actually the CEO. So very business-minded individual. They kind of talked about, he would just tear people apart during briefings if they didn't, support their numbers and things like that. He became a very numbers kind of production, bottom line, dollars and cents kind of guy. So a lot of our strategy revolved around, how many tons of bombs did we drop, and it's kind of grotesque to think about it kind of nowadays, but enemy body counts. So how many enemies did we kill, with this battle or that battle? So, the Pentagon was kind of able to portray this picture that, hey, the war was going well, we killed these, tens of thousands of enemy soldiers and Viet Cong. However, that doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of actually winning a war. Yes.
Wasn't that when they started televising and showing how many people got killed on each side every night?
Yes, they did that. So it was kind of on the news. This was kind of the first major U.S. war, also that kind of got a lot of television time. So people at home sitting there watching NBC. Walter Cronkite was the big guy to watch at the time. They would kind of get live feeds. We'll talk about that kind of more in the coming weeks about how the war just increasingly became unpopular. So again, that kind of televising the war made it an unpopular war. Remember, the 1960s were a huge time of change in the United States. So President Johnson, JFK, and Johnson later, a lot of domestic programs getting pushed through Congress at the time. Civil Rights Act, Social Security Act, lots of good stuff going on at home. But at the same time, while he's trying to pass, all this legislation at home, Johnson was trying to balance that with, hey, I need to keep support for these domestic programs. So, I gotta kind of keep the more right-wing people happy by kind of supporting this war, being tough on communism. So he's kind of playing a balancing act, and obviously hindsight is 2020, and we kind of see where that maybe that steady approach, kind of gradual, they call it graduated response, where we're just kind of going to do enough just to try to defeat the enemy without overwhelming them with, heavy bombings with overwhelming force, enough to actually defeat the enemy. That kind of strategy did not work. Kind of as, further problems with U.S. strategy, I kind of talked about it a little bit already, but we kind of got so focused on the Viet Cong in the south that we didn't really focus on the real enemy, the North Vietnamese army, the North Vietnamese military government. So we kind of just continued, focusing too much on the south, focusing on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You saw kind of with those goofy sensors where they could just drive a truck back and forth. Where we were too worried about cutting off those supplies in the south, where we weren't going after the source of those supplies in North Vietnam, whether they were coming from Hanoi or areas in the northeast portion of the country, namely Haiphong Harbor. That was kind of the main harbor where they brought in war material from China and Russia. Okay, just a few more key topics here. We talked about U.S. strategy in the 1950s, massive retaliation. Again, nuclear arsenal kind of was our main weapon during that time. And then President Johnson, they kind of talked about it a little bit in the video. He was micromanaging actually a lot of the bombing from the Oval Office in the White House. So kind of selecting key targets, and by the time all that information flowed from him through the Pentagon, through 13th Air Force in Hawaii, through the 7th Air Force in Vietnam, obviously the situation on the ground was very, very different. Coupled with McNamara's kind of obsession with numbers, kind of was a U.S. obsession kind of with technology. We never thought that we could ever lose to a third world country like Vietnam. So oftentimes we use technology and firepower as a substitute for overall manpower, trying to outgun the enemy rather than outthink them. Kind of all along the same time, we're relying on this technology, trying to rely on body counts of the enemy dead. At the same time, our casualties were mounting, and the war was growing unpopular at home. That's kind of big overview of the first few years of the war. So we're going to kind of talk briefly about the Paris peace talks, kind of how we started working in 1968 onward towards trying to achieve peace in Vietnam. So 1968 was an election year. Who was elected president? Nixon. Very good. So Johnson actually did not run again for president in 1967. He had enough. And President Nixon started kind of his own new policy in Vietnam. They kind of said it at the end of the video. One word, starts with a V. Vietnamization. So kind of starting to hand the war back over to the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese. So right around May of 1968, the United States kind of started reducing our bombing efforts, particularly kind of in the southern areas of North Vietnam, mainly in an effort to kind of show good faith to the North Vietnamese that we were willing to throttle back and put an end to the war. Kind of at the same time, we were doing backdoor negotiations with the North Vietnamese. So Secretary of State Henry Kissinger often met with negotiator from North Vietnam. You don't need to know his name. His name is Le Duc Tho. He was the chief negotiator for the North. They were called the Paris peace talks because oftentimes these talks actually happen in Paris. Kind of classical, European war thought. You have peace talks in Paris or Versailles or wherever you can in France. So, unfortunately though, and the U.S. did not see this at the time. North Vietnam was just kind of biding their time. They'd come talk to the peace talks, basically kind of stall, then come back to the peace talks, stall some more. So it was kind of the stalling game from basically 1968 to 1972. So they kind of had, it was, as a former colony, Vietnam had seen a number of kind of Western powers come in, over the past several hundred years. And they kind of knew that, eventually the U.S. would get tired of fighting the war and would eventually leave. Kind of along these same years, particularly kind of 1969 and 1972, U.S. slowly started withdrawing troops as we were kind of further handing more and more of the missions over to the South Vietnamese. So by 1972, there were approximately 200,000 Americans left in South Vietnam. Obviously, that was still kind of too many for the U.S. to kind of call it mission complete. So kind of right around that same time, 1972, March of 72, North Vietnam launched a major conventional invasion of the South. So by conventional, we're talking tanks, we're talking 120,000 infantry troops as well. Basically, they went south of the 17th parallel into the northern provinces of South Vietnam. South Vietnam kind of had some initial problems repelling this initial invasion. However, the U.S., we kind of stepped up our game as far as bombing went. We were able to help repel this invasion with Operation Linebacker 1, which we'll talk more about. Ultimately, the North's invasion failed. Of that 120,000 troops they sent south, 50,000 were killed in the invasion, so almost kind of 50% of casualty rate. And basically, as a result of that invasion, of us kind of stepping up our bombings in Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2, which we'll talk about next week, where basically we kind of went no holds bar on North Vietnam, bombed the capital, bombed major cities, bombed dams, basically bombed anything of value to the North Vietnamese people. We did reach an uneasy peace in January of 1973. But we'll end there for today. Next week we'll talk briefly about kind of the fall of South Vietnam. Watch another video on that. Get talking more in depth about the particular missions the Air Force was flying throughout the war. So, any questions before we depart today? And we got a guest speaker lined up. I think he's going to be here in about 3 weeks from now. Another UW grad, not the same guy. He was here a couple weeks ago for a break. But a Vietnam veteran, 1966 or 67 UW graduate. He actually retired from the Wisconsin Air National Guard out at Truex Field. So he's a huge history buff. Works for the Wisconsin State Historical Society. So lots of good stuff he'll be bringing in. Any questions? All right. Have a good week.
One time. I don't have to work anymore.